Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Gaspar Mule. I'm an advocate working for South Sudan Law Society. And South Sudan Law Society is an association of South Sudanese lawyers registered and formed as a national non-governmental organization with an aim of promoting rule of law and access to justice in South Sudan. Today, South Sudan Law Society is privileged to organize a stakeholders briefing on the Geneva Conventions, which are four conventions related to the law of war or humanitarian law, and the South Sudan Geneva Conventions Act 2012. And we are thankful to our donors, UN Women, for supporting this initiative. The aim of this stakeholders briefing is, of course, to create awareness on the Geneva Conventions that South Sudan have ratified related to regulations of war in South Sudan, as well as the law adopted in 2012, which is really to implement the Geneva Conventions in South Sudan. And we also, as part of the aim of this briefing, is for us to discuss the progress and challenges related to implementation of the Geneva Conventions in South Sudan, as well as the Geneva Conventions Act 2012. And we also look forward, as part of the discussions for today, for us to develop strategies to increase awareness on the Geneva Conventions and the Geneva Conventions Act 2012 in South Sudan, as well as the strategies of improving its implementation in South Sudan. These conventions are particularly important in South Sudan in this context. As we engage in conflict, it's important for us to know that South Sudan has committed to international conventions that regulate war in South Sudan. And secondly, is that it has adopted a law for ensuring implementation of humanitarian law in South Sudan. Perhaps to highlight briefly in terms of these four conventions and what they protect, is that these four conventions, conventions number one, relates to protection of wounded soldiers in the context of war. That means that wounded soldiers from any part involved in a war are entitled to protections and to medical treatment, regardless of their political affiliation. And then the second conventions relate to protection of wounded soldiers in a context of sea or even in erect ships that they are in. And they are also entitled to protection, including organizations like Red Cross that provide that type of protection to wounded soldiers. And the convention number 3 relates to protection of prisoners of war. People who have surrendered or people who are arrested in a context of war are entitled to human protection in a sense that they need not to be mistreated, they need not to be tortured, and they should be allowed to have communications with their family members, and they should be able to access medical treatment and basic human treatment, and that at the end of war they should be allowed to return to where they come from. And this is very important in the context of South Sudan as well. And convention number 4 really relates to protection of civilians in context of war. This primarily states that civilians need to be distinguished from soldiers, and they in no way can be the target of war. That means civilians, including their property, need to be distinguished. And the strategies and weapons we use in terms of armed conflict should ensure that they cannot indiscriminately target both soldiers and civilians in the same place. So soldiers engaged in a military combat need to be able to devise strategies that ensure separate civilians from military targets, and both civilians and properties of civilians are entitled to legal protections under the Geneva Conventions that South Sudan have ratified and protected further by the Geneva Conventions Act 2012, which South Sudan has adopted in 2012. Thank you.
I would like to ask, what is the significance of this workshop, particularly at this time where we are having some kind of conflict that is some part of South Sudan? So how is it going to benefit the people who are here and then people who are outside there?
This is really particularly important for us, the South Sudan Law Society. Our role is to remind our country in times like this about the laws we have committed ourselves to and the international conventions we have ratified that regulate contexts like this. So the significance of this is that South Sudan seems to be building tensions toward conflict, and of course in some parts of the country it's already happening. It's important for us to remind ourselves that we have both international and national obligation in way of how do we conduct these conflicts, and most importantly, how do we protect civilians and their properties in the context of a conflict. So that is really highlighting the importance of the workshop for today.
I want to talk about the protection of civilians, protection of prisoners of war. I don't know how we can put it. Now we have a third party involved in this conflict. For example, the UPDF. Are they also applied, to this convention in case like we have had some unconfirmed news that they're using some weapons that are not allowed to be used, like kind of chemical weapon in some parts. So how is it going to apply this convention in terms of having foreign force part of this conflict?
Thank you. I would like not to characterize the conduct of the UPDF in terms of the conflict in South Sudan, because that requires further investigations and establishment of facts and evidence. But what I would make certain is that all the four conventions, the Geneva conventions related to the law of war, are equally applicable to the UPDF as they are applicable to the SSPDF in South Sudan, for two reasons. One is they are operating in a country that has ratified those conventions, and second is the Uganda itself has also ratified all the four conventions related to war. And thirdly is that since they operate in the territory of South Sudan, they are also equally under the Geneva Conventions Act 2012 for South Sudan. So any misconduct that would constitute a breach of these conventions or the South Sudan Conventions Act 2012 constitute a crime that is punishable both by the courts of South Sudan as well as international law.
And what are you going to do as a South Sudan Law Society in case if this happens? Are you going to maybe to open a case against them, maybe in international or regional courts?
The decision of opening a case would be too far to preempt at the moment, but definitely what we are doing is to monitor the situations and document how a conflict has been conducted in South Sudan. Based on evidence and reports from there, to determine whether our options is to open a case or to engage in a diplomatic engagement to ensure that lessons are learned from what is happening and improvements are done related to the future. So the outcome of the decision related to what is happening now, depending on our investigation and the monitoring and the final facts and evidence that we have related to the conduct of the conflict.